Hello, everyone. My name is Serhiy Plokhy. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute, and it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you to the Sochor Parry Memorial Lecture in Ukrainian Politics, and also to introduce our today's speaker, Maria Sonevytsky. So I'll start with, first of all, welcoming the members of Sochor family who are here. Thank you very much for coming. And we'll say a few words about Professor Sochor and also the program itself. So in the year 2000, Sochor's Paris family and friends established with the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University here the Sochor Parry Memorial Lecture. Dr. Sochor Parry was a professor at Clark University, with significant, and she was a publication record and respected scholar in the field of Soviet and East European history and politics. From the early 1980s until her death in February 1998, she was a member of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. The goal of the fund that was created is to endow yearly lecture in her name. We have at this point a biannual lecture. So for those of you who would like to help, to contribute, we are certainly open to do that. Our today's speaker is Maria Sonevytsky. She is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Music at Bard College. She is author of the award-winning book Wild Music, Sound and Sovereignty in Ukraine, published in the year 2019, and Voplivo do Plyasova Stanci in 2023. I assume it is in Ukrainian or not?
No, unfortunately, only English.
It is only in English, but the title is already translated, it looks like, into Ukrainian.
They forced me to title it that way because of the series.
Of the series?
Into Ukrainian.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, it is part of Bloomberg's 33/1/3 series. So Professor Sonevytsky has published articles, apart from books, on folklore and nuclear experience after Chernobyl, epistemic imperialism after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Crimean Tatar, indigenous politics and expressive culture, and the circulation of post-Soviet Ukrainian folklorized kitsch or sharovarshchina, among other subjects. She is currently at work on her third book, tentatively titled Singing for Lenin in Ukraine, column Children, Music, and the Communist Future. In addition to her scholarly writing, Professor Sonevytsky is a singer and accordionist. So, Maria, welcome to Harvard, welcome to Sirius.
Thank you so much. It's always embarrassing to hear yourself talked about in that way, but it's all true. And the Sharovarshchina piece actually just was published today. It's open access on UCL Press, so you can check that out. I want to thank Emily Channell-Justice, who is unfortunately not able to be here tonight, but for organizing this, to Professor Plokhy for the invitation, and to Hannah for the administrative support. I'm really looking forward to your feedback on this talk because it's very much a work in progress. And I promise for those of you who don't know how to parse this banner image that I will kind of decode it later in the talk. And I just kind of want to acknowledge also that I'm presenting this lecture 2 days after a very bitter anniversary, the third year since Russia's full-scale invasion, and at a moment when U.S. relations with Ukraine appeared to be sucked into a new spiral of, let's call it, colonial vertigo. This lecture does try to account for these recent events, but only insofar as they elucidate dynamics that pre-existed the current moment. So the talk is structured in 3 parts, and I'm aiming for approximately 50 minutes. Part 1 will attempt to locate ourselves in the disorienting web of discourses of decolonization of the present, in which they are hijacked by the same people conducting what is plainly, to me, a neo-imperial war in Ukraine. I've come up with the diagnostic I'm calling decolonial vertigo to describe this dizzying phenomenon. Part 2 offers a few snapshots from the so-called musical front since 2022. For our purposes today, these examples will be centered around the mythologized figure of Tchaikovsky, which means that my concern with the legacy of the Soviet Union, once described by Nancy Conde as the anti-imperialist empire, and whose reputation as an ally to post-war decolonization movements is exploited by Putin today, interweaves with the earlier Russian imperial model that proudly declared itself an empire. In part 3, I'm going to attempt to braid strands from parts 1 and 2 together through an examination of musical greatness and its operations, how potent ideas about greatness help to sentimentalize, mask, sustain, and even ennoble Russian distortions of contemporary imperial aggression so that they can be packaged and received by specific audiences as decolonial. I'll touch here through debates about boycotting and canceling Tchaikovsky upon quite asymmetrical perceptions of Russian and Ukrainian wartime cultural diplomacy in the world, especially in the realm of so-called high culture, an asymmetry with real stakes in terms of how the world's sympathies align with the invader and the invaded in the Russo-Ukrainian context. And I'll conclude with a brief meditation on how we might try to meaningfully engage these spiraling decolonial culture wars, though I want to say clearly and upfront that I am not calling anywhere for the cancellation of Tchaikovsky. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of this talk is looking at the Russian appropriation of certain discourses, and I'm mindful of the fact that in a talk about Ukrainian politics, there's a lot of attention to the Russian case. But what I'm trying to look at is how these discourses operate and circulate in these spheres in different ways. So I hope that sounds like a good enough rationale. So part 1, decolonial vertigo. We are living through an era of decolonial vertigo. The most pronounced symptom to me, personally, is intellectual nausea, but I believe the unsettling effects of this decolonial vertigo are more consequential than that. Which brings me to the first, and not likely to be controversial premise of this talk, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a bid not only for the territory of Ukraine, nor just a claim upon the history and future of Ukraine as a sovereign entity, but also an attempt to challenge and remake the world order. So it was an act of world-making, in other words, but perhaps with a dubious agenda attached. The premise that this is a war to remake the global order appears as a point of consensus among otherwise opposed actors, from politicians to intellectuals, and it is often presented as a premise wrapped in rhetorics of decolonization. Take, for example, how Putin's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has described the invasion as an act to, quote, free the world from the neo-colonial oppression of the West, and has promised to stand, quote, in solidarity with the African demands to complete the process of decolonization, end quote. Putin, who insists that Russia has never colonized anyone, has described Russia as leading a, quote, anti-colonial movement against unipolar hegemony, end quote. Commentators have underscored how Russia's anti-colonial rhetoric is, quote, a theme developed to attract Asian, Middle Eastern, African, and other states to an imperialist endeavor, end quote. Nikolai Smirnov summarized the paradox aptly, quote, in the case of Russia, the decolonial struggle against Western hegemony turns into an imperialist war against the decolonial uprising of the Ukrainians, end quote. In another camp, the anti-Putin activist and political theorist Ilya Budraitskis, in a 2023 article asking, what kind of decolonization do we need, described the Russian invasion's, quote, ambitious ideological goal, the complete revision of the political and moral concepts underpinning the European consensus since World War II, end quote. While Budraitskis, of course, rejects the Putinist co-optation of decolonial rhetoric, he agrees that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a bid to remake the global order, and while questioning how Russia itself might be decolonized, also notes that, quote, Putin sees the invasion of Ukraine as the beginning of a new decolonization, which he calls for Asia, Africa, and even Europe, which is also enslaved by the Anglo-Saxons, to continue, end quote. US officials across the Biden-Trump administrations concur that the global order is at stake in Ukraine. Former Secretary of State Anthony Blinken asserted that, quote, the international rules-based order critical to maintaining peace and security is being put to the test by Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine, end quote. But as evidenced by the high-velocity events of recent weeks, the Trump administration is aligning instead with Putin's strongman vision for this revised global order, advancing planks, which I'm sure we've all heard about, such as extorting Ukraine for its mineral resources, seizing the Panama Canal, buying Greenland, making Canada the 51st state, and renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, an exercise in neo-colonial critical toponymy that was immediately aped by the Russian communist politician Denis Bulanov, who proposed to rename the Black Sea into the Russian Sea. This foreign policy agenda has recently been described as, quote, make colonialism great again, end quote. The potential compatibility of Trump's apparent neo-imperialist ambitions with Putinist neo-imperial and civilizational claims is chilling, to say the least, and perhaps the intellectual contortions required to repackage such US expansionism in Putinist terms as a new and improved anti-colonial imperialism will prove to be unnecessary or impossible. But as the political theorist Miri Davidson details in a brilliantly clarifying 2024 article titled Decolonialism of the Far Right, it has become common among far-right actors to, quote, speak the language of imperial renaissance and decolonization in the same breath, end quote. And I'm going to return to that quote, which is why it's the only one in white. In that same article, Davidson persuasively argues that far-right Russian philosophers like Alexander Dugin and French philosophers like René Camus, who claimed that, quote, all the major texts in the fight against decolonization apply admirably to France, especially those of Frantz Fanon, end quote. Let's just consider that for one moment. Go to the well of Carl Schmitt to justify positions that seem on their face paradoxical. Schmitt, the political theorist associated with the Nazi regime, argued that there was such a thing as legitimate territorial imperialism, which Schmitt opposed to illegitimate, disparate, or sea-based thalassocratic models of imperialism, in which, in Davidson's terms, we see, quote, an impressive realignment. Territorial empire building becomes compatible with a certain anti-colonial sentiment. For his part, Walter Mignolo, the Argentine-born literary scholar, professor at Duke University, and perhaps the most prominent of contemporary decolonial thinkers, also builds his theories from Carl Schmitt's work. Miri Davidson is unsparing in showing how Mignolo's and Dugin's concept become at times nearly interchangeable. Dugin's multipolar world order is premised on what he calls the fourth political theory, which has become a slogan for the decolonization of political consciousness, a theory advanced first through the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Walter Mignolo makes sense of Russia's bid for a multipolar world through its invasion of Ukraine as kicking off what he calls the third nomos of the earth, building upon Schmitt, and writing in typically bombastic terms that, quote, Russia's 2022 special operation in Ukraine, responding to NATO's provocations, with the collaboration of Ukrainian government to contain Russia, is a signpost of the change of era and the advent of the multipolar world order that is tantamount with the advent of the third nomos of the earth, end quote. And I'll just note here Mignolo's usage of Putinist language that characterizes the invasion not as a war, but as a special military operation. Meanwhile, Walter Mignolo's decades-long collaborator in decolonial thought, who is also a Russian-born scholar and outspoken critic of Putin's invasion, Madina Tlostanova, who is best known for bringing the Latin American decolonial tradition to the post-Soviet context, has noted how Russia, quote, camouflages its imperial ambitions in anti-colonial pathos and a critique of the West, which is skillfully used by the Russian administration to brainwash a population that is already distracted by serious economic and social problems and marked by defuturing tendencies. This imperial appropriation of post-colonial rhetoric also targets the Western left, who reflect on the Russian situation from safe positions and often praise President Vladimir Putin's escapades for their anti-Americanism. However, that position remains blind to the fate of those at whose expense the dangerous neo-imperial attacks are made, end quote. Increasingly, in public talks delivered since 2022, Tlostanova seems aware that this comfortable critique applies to Walter Mignolo himself, but she has not, to my knowledge, criticized his positions by name in written or in spoken appearances. And so just to put a button on this, I have animated the slide to make us experience that vertiginous... Okay, there we go. Just as further evidence, this is from the TASS, the Russian news agency, with the headline, "Russia has never acted as colonizer, unlike the West," right? Which is one of Putin's refrains. Okay, one more meanwhile in this vertiginous scene. As the vocabulary of anti-colonialism appears in the mouths of Russian war criminals, in European far-right philosophers and leftist intellectuals at the pinnacle of the Anglophone Academy, it also proliferates throughout Ukraine, evidenced by a boom in writing, podcasts, and scholarship dedicated to decolonizing this or that. Sometimes the target of Ukrainian decolonization is Russia, with scholars rightfully, in my view, pointing towards Russia's imperial innocence and urgent need for a reckoning with its imperial past and present. And that concept of imperial innocence comes from Marat and Kasimbekova. But as often, Ukrainians are targeting Ukrainian culture for decolonization, delinking from legacies of Russian imperialism, claiming or reclaiming cultural and political figures as Ukrainian, or purging elements of the contested Soviet past by felling monuments or renaming sites and streets, sometimes lamentably substituting the dishonored figures of the Russo-Soviet past with troubling figures from the Ukrainian nationalist past, who become redeemed in this discourse as decolonial heroes. In some cases, policies of decommunization share rhetorical space with policies of decolonization. In others, rhetorics of decolonization mingle uncomfortably with discourses of primordial nationalism. Notably, on the Ukrainian side, there is seldom talk of decolonization from Austro-Hungarian or Ottoman legacies, and discussion of Ukraine's dependencies on the US and Europe were largely consigned to relatively small circles of Ukrainian left scholars, but recent events have expanded awareness of America's neo-colonial appetite for Ukrainian resources. And so this is a slide from one of the podcasts. It says decolonizatorki, so it's like a feminized version of decolonizers. And when I asked one of the prominent decolonizatorki about her feelings about US empire, she answered that it is not the US that is saying we do not exist. And it's sad to say that under the new regime, I'm not sure that this remains a certainty. So what to make of this vertiginous adoption of the rhetorics of decolonization? Though I'm not quite ready to write the companion screed to Olufemi Taiwo's lively Against Decolonization, in which he takes aim specifically at African intellectuals of decolonization, but also manages to wholesale dismiss the Latin American school of decolonial thought, Taiwo's displeasure with how decolonization rhetorics have, quote, become a catch-all trope often used to perform contemporary morality or authenticity does resonate with me strongly. I share too in Medina Tlostanova's 2023 observation about how, quote, decolonization has turned into a shallow tag or trivial metaphor in which the anti-post and decolonial rhetoric is being hijacked by different players. But I disagree with her diagnosis that this is due to a vacuum of liberatory ideologies, because I do believe in the Ukrainian case there has been a case-specific, and so yes, therefore not universalist, but very clear liberatory ideology, the liberation of Ukrainian territories from Russian occupation, and the refusal to accept a future akin to Belarus's. To my mind, this is a circumscribed, but rather straightforward anti-colonial and emancipatory goal. So let's talk about the decolonial culture war a bit here. Adrian Ivakhiv, in a 2023 article, outlined a growing rift among Ukrainian left and left liberal thinkers on the respective roles of economics and of culture in social change. He asked whether, quote, political, economic, or cultural ideological explanations best account for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and by extension, to what extent both the invasion and the resistance are motivated by ideology, end quote. Ivakhiv labels two diverging positions as economism, or economic determinism, according to which economics trumps all other explanations, that is Ivakhiv's definition, versus the position he calls culturalism, or explanatory pluralism, since culturalists rarely deny the role of economics, but only de-emphasize it. In this lecture, I want to examine the ideology that has motivated the invasion and its resistance in culturalist terms in the arena of music, with a focus on the ideology of musical greatness, which allows us to examine how the Russian state has articulated its rationale and vision for the conquest of Ukrainian sovereign territories, and how Ukrainians have responded to claims of imperial greatness and musical supremacy. In other words, I'm asking us, to paraphrase Slavoj Žižek's words, not to, quote, underestimate the material force of ideology. I turn to music here not only because it is my first disciplinary home base as an ethnomusicologist, but also because the arena of music, especially elite musical practice, potently exposes the improbability or even the incoherence of various decolonial claims. In a 2024 article co-authored by Sharakadze, Sigua, and Peter Schmeltz on the decolonization of Georgian and Ukrainian music, the authors seek to make explicit, quote, the ways in which the USSR used music to articulate an imperial identity, end quote, and they argue that studying the musical arena reveals the USSR as a Russo-centric colonial enterprise more clearly than by investigating its geopolitical maneuvering alone. This spotlighting effect, afforded by a culturalist approach centered on music, productively targets the puzzle of why Russia's supposedly decolonial war deploys high imperial culture at every moment of so-called liberation, and why Russian appeals to the global South for sympathy might work even despite their imperialist cultural diplomacy, which is grounded on Eurocentric norms of musical supremacy. Part 2, postcards from the musical front. And I want to acknowledge here that in the last year or so, maybe more now, there's been an emerging critique that making a metaphor of the front is a problem for many Ukrainians. And I want to acknowledge that discourse, in part because it diverts us from the fact that there is a real military physical front. So I note this, but I'm still using the phrase here because I think it artfully captures a reality of how these debates about music unfold against the backdrop of war and destruction. And I apologies in advance for some of the brutal imagery that I'm about to show. The imagery is not so brutal, but the examples are brutal. Postcard 1, Mariupol and the theater of wartime neo-colonial appropriation. Russia bombed the Mariupol Drama Theater on March 16, 2022. In front of the building, in huge Cyrillic script, was written the word children. Russia dropped 2 500-kilogram bombs on the building 3 weeks into their full-scale invasion, entombing an estimated 600 civilians, including many children. The international human rights community identifies this unambiguously as a war crime. 6 months after this horrific event, the Russian occupation regime staged a dramatic concert in front of the burnt facade of the drama theater. The concert, performed by the Kremlin State Orchestra, conducted by Konstantin Chudovsky, included Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. The Fourth Symphony is commonly known by its programmatic title, Fate, so ascribing to Tchaikovsky's 1878 symphonic work the message that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was preordained, positioning Tchaikovsky, who is commonly described as Russia's greatest composer, as a kind of prophet for the cause of Great Russia's so-called reunification with its southern provinces. Russian media reports at the time rhapsodized over the beauty of the concert. And this is an extended quote. Probably the state Kremlin Orchestra has never played in such a setting. And never before has it been listened to in such a way. Among the destroyed houses, in front of the blown-up theater right on the square, in the streets, many hundreds of people sat and stood, caught every sound, every note, and it seemed that together with the amazing music of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, hope for a happier life returned to them. And the figures of miners and grain growers, which is on the facade of the building, cut by shrapnel, supporting the remains of the theater roof, seemed to come to life under the rays of multicolored theater spotlights. So that's an example from some of the news coverage that followed. And for the sake of showing you the evidence, I thought we could listen to a very brief clip where you can see the burned out facade and the orchestra playing. So let's see if this will work. Artur Tchomaya, who programmed the concert for the Russian Commission on Humanitarian Projects, titled the program Mariupol in the Name of Life. He told Rossiyskaya Gazeta that, quote, when the audience began to listen, they understood everything and saw it with their own eyes. And through your wonderful newspaper, I would like to convey to all Mariupol residents the most sincere wishes of happiness. God grant that we survive all these hardships and can meet more often in theaters. Russian culture lives in our hearts, and today Russian music sounds in Russian Mariupol. Yes, Russian Mariupol, fated to be returned to Great Russia. In a 2022 essay, Ilya Budraitskis noted how fate operates in contemporary Putinist decolonial discourse. Quote, if in World War II, as Putin believes, the Soviet Union was merely an avatar of the eternal historical Russia, then Russia is organically anti-fascist and all its external opponents are potentially Nazis. In this construction, the fight against the absolute evil of Nazism becomes one and the same as the struggle for global dominance by Russia. Morality and geopolitics merge into a fundamentally inseparable whole, and entire nations become carriers of ideas, good or evil, solely based on their essence, their historical fate, which contemporaries can't alter, end quote. Therefore, the positive moral charge of Putin's decolonial rhetorics, we must invade to kill off the Ukrainian Nazi threat with the double benefit of fending off what Putin calls the US's global neocolonial dictatorship, is coupled to the historical fate apparently presaged by Tchaikovsky. Sometime after this performance of musical triumphalism, the ruins of the Mariupol Drama Theater were encased in scaffolding and wrapped with a banner that featured a pantheon of great male cultural luminaries. So this image is of the Mariupol Drama Theater in that scaffolding, and this is the graphic that I made to, again, represent the vertiginous experience of witnessing this unfold. Here's another view of it. So on the left, we have Pushkin. And next, Tolstoy with his voluminous beard. And then we have Gogol, Nikolai Hohol to Ukrainians, a hybrid kind of figure in the literary pantheon. And then on the far right, you'll see Taras Shevchenko. Taras Shevchenko, the freed serf who became the romantic poet hero of Ukraine in the 19th century, the modernizer of the Ukrainian language. Needless to say, to absorb these four literary figures into the canon of Russian greatness is to undermine and erase the comparatively fragile Ukrainian literary canon, which places Shevchenko, the innovator of the modern Ukrainian language, and the poet who called his fellow Ukrainians to shake free from the shackles of Russian imperialism, at its center. From the staging of Tchaikovsky's Fourth to the scaffolding wrap of literary greats, we see how the Russian occupation regime reimagines occupied urban space through the assertion of Russian cultural dominance, literary appropriation, and the performance of musical supremacy as an inverted and addled gesture of decolonial triumphalism. Postcard 2. We will rock you. And I'm indebted very much here to Lena Lessen's research on this particular phenomenon. So this is the other example I want to give from the Russian side, which focuses on the viral mashup of Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 with Queen's We Will Rock You at the Beijing Winter Olympics in 2022, a phenomenon described by Lena Lesson as, quote, the appropriation of Tchaikovsky's composition as an irredentist anthem in contemporary Russia. Lesson documents how the Russian producer who goes by DJ Smash premiered the mashup on TikTok, introducing a hashtag that makes a pun of the Russian Olympic Committee acronym, ROC. And this is just a reminder that at this point in 2022, the Russians were not allowed to compete because of a doping scandal. This was before the full-scale invasion. So ROC, which also then when spelled in Cyrillic letters, makes the first three letters of Rossiya, right, when it's transliterated. So with apologies, I'm going to play for you this mashup that went viral on TikTok because I think it's worth hearing what DJ Smash did in this instance. Of the Russian national anthem, the Russian Olympic Committee had adopted Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 as the tune that would play when the ROC won any medals at the Olympics. And DJ Smash's viral mashup did what it was meant to do on TikTok and became a kind widely remediated on social media. With the hashtag We Will Rock You. It was even promoted by Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, who called on supporters of Russia to promote the campaign. He said, quote, there is no doubt that your detractors wanted an evil fate to dominate the Russian Olympic Committee and the Russian national team at the Games. This idea failed, and in fact, the hashtag We Will Rock You will remain as a symbol of your abilities and desire to win, end quote. Sorry, the first two examples are... The whole talk is bleak. I can't pretend that it's not. So just acknowledging that. Tchaikovsky, through the use of his piano concerto as a substitute anthem for the Russian nationals who participated in the Olympics, and through this jingoistic viral mashup, becomes intimately linked with mundane and permissible expressions of Russian nationalism, what Michael Billig memorably called banal nationalism, which would, just 4 days following the conclusion of the Beijing Winter Olympics, be supercharged into the frenzied Russian nationalism that accompanied Putin's decision to invade Ukraine and attempt to encircle its capital city of Kyiv. The affective contagion of the viral TikTok mashup activates the power of music to move bodies in time to the same beat and the same message. It catalyzes the semiotic chain from Tchaikovsky's greatness to Russian sports pride into frenzied support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine that would be framed only a few short days after the Olympics closing ceremony on February 20th, 2022, as a decolonial project, Russia on the ramparts against the imperialist West. A viral music mashup links the co-opted language of decolonization to resurgent imperial greatness. As the Ukrainian scholar Maxim Strycha bluntly put it in 2023, quote, whether we like it or not, today Tchaikovsky is one of the symbols of Putin's imperial Russia, end quote. What is debated among scholars is whether Tchaikovsky in his own lifetime could be understood as an agent of great Russian power. Rutger Helmers has argued that Tchaikovsky's compositional practice was, quote, an exercise of symbolic control, end quote, over the little Russian territory that he so loved to visit. The German scholar Christoph Flamm has documented various efforts to, quote, conquer the Russian colony by compositional means, end quote. Lena Lesson reminds about how Tchaikovsky, quote, nurtured several politically and financially important relationships with the Russian monarchy, including Tsar Alexander III, end quote. In my own work, I found it illuminating to learn about the different choices made by Tchaikovsky's contemporary Mykola Lysenko. So where one composer cozied to power in the imperial metropole and went on to global renown, the other affiliated with the anti-Tsarist Ukrainophile populist nationalists who advocated for the culture and freedom of enserfed Little Russians. But what is not in dispute is that Tchaikovsky became securely interwoven into the center of the musical canon of Russian greatness across ideological regimes and times and places. Pauline Faircloth notes that by the late 1930s and early 1940s, Tchaikovsky occupied the prime position as the #1 Soviet favorite of all the Russian composers, much as he had in Imperial Russia by the late 1880s. Today, Tchaikovsky maintains his status as the greatest Russian composer, both inside and outside of Russia. And just to take as one piece of evidence, the Princeton musicologist Simon Morrison's 2024 book, which is subtitled to this effect. It's critical to view the matter of Tchaikovsky's greatness, however, not as an objective fact, but as a broader project of elevating and marketing Russian culture as exceptional in its greatness across centuries. In How Russian Literature Became Great, Rolf Hellebust interrogates what he calls the, quote, soteriological imperative, or the salvation myths of Russian literature, a belief that, quote, writers will somehow change reality radically for the better. They will somehow show their readers the way to an eschatological realization of national identity and greatness. They will save Russia, and Russia will save the world, end quote. While focused on the function of literature in not merely, quote, formulating national identity, but revealing national destiny, end quote, Hellebust's arguments stretch quite easily to the canon of Russian art music and resonate strongly with the soteriological mythical function, the Russo-Messianic role assigned to Tchaikovsky in Putin's Russia. Postcard 3, the Tchaikovsky National Academy of Music in Kyiv, Ukraine. So now turning to the presence of Tchaikovsky in Ukraine. Leading up to the centennial of Tchaikovsky's birth in 1940, during the period of high Stalinism, quote, a committee was formed to organize celebrations. The plan, personally approved by Stalin, included publications, performances, and the renaming of the music conservatories in the capital cities of both Russia and Ukraine in honor of Tchaikovsky. This is from Lena Lesson, end quote. Having been established in Imperial Russian Kyiv in 1863, in the post-Soviet mid-1990s, the conservatory was renamed to an Academy of Music, but retained the name of Tchaikovsky in its title. Today, the premier music institution of Ukraine still carries the name of Tchaikovsky, though this has become a persistent debate within Ukrainian circles, again, often framed around the concept of decolonizing the music institution. The Academy is located at the very center of Kyiv. You can see it here, the site of 3 revolutions since 1991. And here you can see the white columns behind a flower bed with a sign that reads, I love Ukraine. Today, that same plaza is covered with flags and memorials to the fallen in the ongoing war. In April of 2022, Olena Korchova, a professor of musicology at the National Music Academy of Kyiv, contributed to an ongoing debate about whether the Tchaikovsky Academy of Music in Kyiv should shed its namesake. Korchova wrote, quote, our enemy is by no means Tchaikovsky himself, but only his simulacrum, the Soviet and Putin ideological brand of the same name, the attachment to which literally ties our hands, deprives us of our freedom, and turns us into hostages of a dead tradition, end quote. In the months following Russia's full-scale invasion, faculty signed open letters demanding the administration rename the institution after a prominent Ukrainian composer, Mykola Lysenko prominently among the candidates. And after the administration refused, some very high-profile faculty, including Alla Zahikevich, the founder of the Kyiv Electronic Music School and a well-respected composer of electroacoustic music, declared their resignation pointedly from the Tchaikovsky Academy of Music. Arguments for keeping the name came from many sides. Tchaikovsky was actually a Ukrainian. Tchaikovsky visited the academy early on and had much to do with its early success. Tchaikovsky is a lucrative brand that can be marketed to attract students, especially from China. And the argument was made that decolonization should not mean purging, but rather integrating the imperial past. On the other side, Ukrainian scholars argued that the premier music academy in the country should bear the name of a Ukrainian composer, since there are worthy, if lesser known, Ukrainian composers deserving of this honor. This would be a symbol of decolonial pride and a challenge to Russian rhetorics of universality and greatness. Debates about scrubbing Tchaikovsky's name from the Academy of Music continue today, but no change has been made, unless it's been made today. I confess I didn't check. All of which is to say, even inside of Ukraine, the so-called canceling of Tchaikovsky has not been so easy to carry out. Postcard 4, the worldwide panic over canceling Tchaikovsky. So my fourth and last postcard from the musical front centers on this panic over canceling Tchaikovsky. In the wake of the full-scale invasion, there were a smattering of orchestras that pulled Tchaikovsky from their programs, among them the Cardiff Symphony, who had programmed the 1812 overture, which includes the sounds of cannon fire. As the orchestral director explained, quote, "The decision on this concert was very much based on the here and now. A member of the orchestra has family directly involved in the Ukraine situation, and we are trying to respect that situation during the immediate term. There were also 2 military-themed pieces as part of the program, March Slav and 1812, that we felt were particularly inappropriate at the time," end quote. The backlash to the backlash began immediately, with a number of think pieces written in defense of continuing to perform Tchaikovsky everywhere and at all times. Of these, Nina Khrushcheva's article, titled "Don't Cancel Russian Culture," warns about denying citizens of the world the great Russian culture that speaks to, quote, "the human condition, not just the Russian one," end quote, the universal human condition. In late 2022, a few months after the Kremlin State Orchestra's staging of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony on the ruins of the Mariupol Theater, the culture minister of Ukraine published a call to boycott what he called Kremlin-favored works until the war's end. Tkachenko may have missed an opportunity to link Ukraine's call for a cultural boycott to the history of other struggles against oppressive regimes where cultural boycott has been a strategy, but he did anticipate some of the critiques that would inevitably come. He wrote, "Boycotting Russian culture is an important step. We're not talking about canceling Tchaikovsky, but rather about pausing performances of his work until Russia ceases its bloody invasion." Tkachenko's piece prompted a mountain of criticism and seemed to have no effect on the lucrative Nutcracker season in the winters of 2022, 2023, or 2024. Part 3, Greatness, Imperialism, and Musical Supremacy. So I want to try to get at the nexus of this construct of greatness and its relationship to imperialism and musical supremacy. And I want to first repeat Miri Davidson's haunting question about how one can speak the language of imperial renaissance and decolonization in the same breath, just so it hangs in the air, as I propose what I'm loftily referring to as 12 theses. I'm nailing them to the door. First, the assertion of greatness is a claim to cultural supremacy and universalism. Second, the concept of universalism was and remains part of the technology of empire, in which I'm following Gary Viswanathan. Third, musical greatness is therefore an extension of the technology of empire. Fourth, musical greatness is a claim to supremacy that correlates to forms of imperial domination. Fifth, music's affective affordances may stimulate emotions, generate intersubjective bonds, and effectively disseminate political messages. Sixth, and here I'm borrowing from the late scholar Richard Taruskin, who wrote about the danger of music, where he noted that music, especially high culture, so-called high culture music from Europe, which is intimately linked to ideas of Enlightenment universalism, is treated with a special kind of sentimental complacency, which attempts to cleave aesthetics from politics and heroicizes the composer's process over music's function as a communicative medium in the present. 7, Such sentimental complacency enables the belief that music can be extricated from politics and impedes our ability to see the damage that music can cause. Though I will say in music studies in the last 20 years, the literature on music and torture, especially in the US so-called war on terror, has drawn more attention to the dynamics of musical danger and harm. Next, number 8. And here I'm citing an influential formulation introduced by the political scientist Vyacheslav Morozov, introduced over a decade ago. This is the same Vyacheslav Morozov who was in June of 2024 sentenced to 6 years in an Estonian prison for working as a Russian spy. The idea of Russia as a subaltern empire operates as a power masking trick that allows for a decolonial inversion that merges classic imperial civilizational tropes with rhetorics of decolonization. 9. Because Russia's decolonial inversion allows for the conflation of imperial expansion with the politics of decolonization, there is a seamless continuity between historical and contemporary Russian practices of marketing the universality and greatness of its culture while exempting it from the critique that this culture is Eurocentric and exclusionary. In contrast, Ukrainian internal debates about what to do with the legacies of people like Tchaikovsky on the territory of Ukraine, seen in the example of the Academy of Music, and its calls for a pause on programming Russian imperial culture, paired with various compensatory strategies aimed at filling in gaps in existing canons with Ukrainian composers, has been criticized as, quote, a civilizational and exclusionary approach to wartime diplomacy, end quote, and blamed for Ukraine's failure to generate sympathy and solidarity from the global South. And I want to say here that the constructive critique that Nguyen provides makes a general claim about how Ukrainian assertions of its belonging to Europe have alienated potential allies who were once colonized by European maritime empires. But here we see another inversion in perceptions, right? In the case of the global South, Russia uses imperialist tactics and rhetoric, yet is largely exempted from anti-colonial critique, whereas Ukraine deploys decolonial rhetoric and is perceived as siding with empires or embracing Russophobia, in Putin's other favorite formulation. 11. In the West especially, Ukrainian calls for cultural boycott are perceived as depriving the world of artworks that speak to the universal human condition. And finally, 12. Ukrainian composers remain largely unknown in the world when measured against the brand of Tchaikovsky. All of this contributes to the condition of what I'm calling our contemporary decolonial vertigo. So I think it's worth asking the question, why are there no great Ukrainian composers? In 1970, Pauline Oliveros, an important American feminist experimental composer and accordionist, so very dear to my heart, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times asking, why are there no great women composers? And just noting that this was published a year before Linda Nochlund's book, which was titled, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? Pauline Oliveros takes issue with the way greatness is defined and conferred. It fundamentally excludes the women who had been traditionally barred from work outside the domestic sphere, and worse yet, it squelches creative practice. Oliveros wrote, quote, "It does not matter that not all composers are great composers. It matters that this activity be encouraged among the population, that we communicate with each other in non-destructive ways," end quote. When we turn to the question of why there are no great Ukrainian composers, some of Oliveros's analysis translates. Who determines, to borrow from Lydia Gur's influential theorization of the work concept of music, the regulative function that sets the rules of the game for what musical greatness means? Do we consent and continue to consent to the rules of this game? Do we consent to the entrenchment of what Gur calls the conceptual imperialism of the musical work in our canons? Post-colonial theory has contributed meaningfully to challenging the logics of greatness and universality. In 1995, the editors of an anthology of post-colonial critique summarized this thematic concern in the following way, quote, "We are often told that what makes Shakespeare or Dante or Goethe great is their ability to reveal something of the universal human condition. Indeed, the universality of writers has been invoked in literary discussions across the English-speaking world as an infallible sign of their stature or their seriousness. The myth of universality is thus a primary strategy of imperial control as it is manifested in literary and, I would add, musical study. End quote. I want to propose that disentangling these bundled concepts of universality, greatness, and musical supremacy, which today are exploited under the Putinist banner of an imperial decoloniality, could be a promising place to anchor oneself amid the swirl of vertiginous decolonizing rhetorics. Greatness as an effect of musical supremacy leads to the ossification of repertoires. It makes us incurious listeners, seeking the sanctified familiar over the unfamiliar. Richard Taruskin, in his characteristically impassioned register, set the stakes very high by asking, quote, "Are we not debased and diminished, both as artists and as human beings, by such a commitment to abstract musical worth?" End quote. What I'm suggesting here is that the concept of greatness must be decolonized, though I'm resistant to making that a slogan. Because the challenge, I think, right now is to find ways to live in this epistemic murk that marks the era of decolonial vertigo and to push past its disorienting effects. This means not only imagining liberation from structures of domination, but also building power towards a future liberation grounded in the practical realization of shared goals. So I'm moving here towards something like a conclusion. As statues and tokens of Russian imperial greatness proliferate throughout the avenues of occupied, or as the Putinists would have it, liberated Ukrainian cities, as Putinist historical narratives swell with sympathy to patriarchal dictators and emperors of the past and present, as these dictators find intellectual allies not only at home but among the US administration and trendy left-wing theorists here too, one might consider jumping overboard the decolonial ship, if just to make the heaving stop. But I was delighted to learn that a common treatment for vertigo is to perform what are called repositioning maneuvers of the head. Doctors teach patients with vertigo to perform these maneuvers, and then they are empowered to do it at home. Because I'm not ready to let go of the promise of decolonization yet, and instead wish to reclaim something from the unfulfilled promises of decolonization as a project of world ordering and world making, without resorting to Putin and Mignolo-style multipolarity that conflates neo-imperial violence with decolonial war. This decolonization would require, as Tarak Barkawi suggested, quote, "a gimlet eye for Western triumphalism and a broad anti-fascist front against enemies near and far," end quote. So I'll conclude today with 3 points. Maybe they are a kind of repositioning maneuvers related to this potential. In the book Freedom Time, the anthropologist and historian Gary Wilder points out that we often, quote, "treat the meaning of decolonization as self-evident by reducing colonial emancipation to national liberation. Underlying such dyadic accounts is the assumption that European states had empires, but were not themselves empires," end quote. Wilder traces the intellectual history of the poet-politicians Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor between the years 1945 to 1960, assessing how these 20th century intellectuals articulated their visions for a post-imperial order otherwise. Césaire and Senghor both argued for a reconfiguration of the relationship between the French colonies and the French imperial metropole, refigured not as a hierarchical relationship, but as equal and interdependent partners, an arrangement that may have impeded the neo-colonial dependencies that followed from the stunted process of decolonization in both Martinique and Senegal. Wilder argues that both men sought to trouble the very stability of the category of France itself. I think it's long past time to trouble the stability of the category of Russia itself, and to lift up thinkers on the periphery who imagine more equitable arrangements between former metropoles and colonies, from Russia's indigenous activists to knowledge producers from the non-Russian former Soviet republics. In music studies and in the institutions that program music, I think we really must strive to interrogate greatness and its enduring logics when it is uncritically reproduced as though it were an objective assessment of fact rather than a historically contingent diagnostic, shot through with imperial logics and imbricated with practices of ongoing neo-colonial domination. And most idealistically, it's my hope that we see very soon a repositioning akin to a renewed non-aligned movement for the 21st century, conceived now not as a rejection of a bipolar world shared between two rival global superpowers, but as a solidaristic union of small and threatened states and stateless peoples against regional and global hegemons, the US among them, in this dangerous multipolar world of rival authoritarianisms that we appear to be entering. We need a powerful anti-imperial coalition for the 21st century. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. You can actually take this chair, and thank you for this very rich and thought-provoking presentation. I got a little bit jealous because we in history, we show images, we don't show people dancing or singing or performing. So it makes for a much better, much more effective presentation. So maybe we'll start with conversation. I'll ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll open floor for questions and comments from the audience. As a historian, I was listening to this presentation and was thinking that the Russia or the Soviet Union and the Moscow policies and riding the wave of decolonization is not particularly new. Mm-hmm. This is very much story of 1950s, late 50s and early 60s in the United Nations in particular. That's also the story when this attempt of really an empire de facto trying to use decolonization in the maritime, in the provinces, in the colonies, was challenged by people like Leo Dobryansky, the Captive Nations campaign, mm-hmm. right? That was about the fact that actually the nations in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union were enslaved, and that the Soviet Union actually had no right to talk on behalf of other nations in the colonies. So that debate in some way is already going for a while. And I'm thinking about the term decolonization and the concept, and it is very West-centered. It's about Western empires at the exclusion of the non-maritime and land-based empires from the Austria-Hungary to the Russian Empire to parts of the Ottoman Empire. And my question is, maybe we actually marching now so enthusiastically in the last 2-3 years under the banners of decolonization are really not only hurting our own chances to really talk about our history and culture, trying to fit somebody else's model, and in that sense, there are other terms and other concepts that are much broader. De-imperialization, for example, which goes beyond the Western empires, goes beyond just anti-Westernism. So my question is about the usefulness of the term and whether really we should accept it uncritically, or we have to maybe look for different terms, but also that means different concepts that actually treat empires and empires worldwide and not just emphasizing the one particular type of empire.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in your comment, and I think the first thing is that this project certainly needs that historicizing element that's missing right now, partly because I just didn't have space here, but some of it is in my footnotes. So I think the ways in which the Soviet Union, and I mean, I'm teaching a class right now on Ukrainian decolonial thought for the second time, and we're reading Ivan Zyuba's Internationalism or Russification, where he reproduces a lot of the debates happening with Lenin among the Bolsheviks at the time, but Lenin is very prominently presented, mm-hmm. where there's a real concern with not allowing great Russian chauvinism, right, to reproduce the dynamics of Russian imperialism. And Zyuba's point and refrain throughout the whole text, right, is that Stalin's failure to enact Lenin's vision is led to that moment in the 60s that he finds himself writing this desperate text. The self-fashioning of the Soviet Union as an anti-imperial empire has been a paradox that has spawned many wonderful book titles, including Empire of Nations, right? And there's all kinds of variations on that phrase. And I think the parallel discourse of the United States is really interesting too, to think about how the United States also positioned itself in the 20th century as it was expanding, as not an empire, right? But when you think of the US's possessions around the world, it's a real question, right? What is Puerto Rico if not a colony today? So I think the historicizing element definitely belongs in this piece. I think what I'm trying to do in this paper, in part, is to reckon with my own desire to recuperate something from these histories of decolonization. And for me, if we make a sort of artificial division, somewhat artificial, but not entirely, generational division between what we might call anti-colonial theory, so like of the 1950s, 1960s, the kind of African wave of decolonizing from the maritime empire, and also the moment of the Bandung Conference and all of that that's happening. And then we think about post-colonial theory, right, which is the subaltern school and Edward Said. And then we think about decolonial theory from the Latin American tradition. If we think about those three generations as kind of semi-distinct, all dealing with similar concerns, to me there's a lot to take from actually the anti-colonial tradition to think about when Frantz Fanon, who I know is a controversial figure, but when Frantz Fanon is thinking as a psychiatrist about the inferiority complex of colonized peoples. I think there's a really strong resonance there for many Ukrainians, right? I've seen it in my own research. And I'm thinking now of when I was conducting research on my second book, and I interviewed the bass player in the first Ukrainian punk band, Vopli Vidoplasova, and he just kind of told me at length about what it was like to discover that he had this resource, this language, that for his whole life he'd been told was like a not cool language, basically, like a really not future-oriented language, not the language of youth, a language of the peasantry, and unlearning that was a kind of an incipient decolonization for him. So I think that there's something really to take from that kind of psychological understanding of the colonized subject from the anti-colonial tradition, and of course this resonates across. But also in the post-colonial tradition, we do have this really potent, I think, critique of universalisms, right? And in particular, you're right, of course, that they're focused on the Western imperial universalism, in particular the British Empire, because of the subaltern school. But there's something to think with there for us as scholars of Ukraine as well, given how well Russia has managed to capitalize on its cultural canons. I think this is really one of the things Russia has succeeded in. And it creates a kind of trap, right? Where then we're told, maybe let's put a pause on Tchaikovsky, and everybody says, how dare you deprive humanity, right, of this artwork that speaks to the universal condition. Not that I think canceling is, the other side of that is canceling Tchaikovsky also plays into, this is what I mean by it being a trap. It also plays into Putin's logics, right, that the whole world is against us and Russophobia, et cetera. Maybe I've strayed from your point, but
thank you. No. It's very good. Actually, you mentioned that, and that's the second question that I wanted to ask about anti-colonialism and post-colonialism, and you mentioned that. Because my understanding is, especially looking at what was happening in literature, at least what I saw there happening, post-colonialism became really very, very important. And now it looks like we're in a different place, or maybe we are not. So you started talking about that. Maybe you can talk a little bit more in the Ukrainian context where we are with post-colonialism versus anti-colonialism.
Yeah, I think
I would want to use anti-imperialism, but the term is not there.
Right.
Yeah.
It's there too, right? And in many ways it appears more in the Leninist rhetoric, it seems like, anti-imperialism. Your question is about kind of where we're at in terms of... Right.
And whether the war actually brought any changes in that regard or not.
I mean, I think the war has, of course, intensified and popularized the discourse of decolonization inside of Ukraine. And I know I'm not treating that as the main topic of this talk, but that could certainly be the cause for a much deeper examination. Mm-hmm. But I quickly mentioned here, right, that I think that there have been really interesting public-facing attempts to think decolonially in ways that I think are incredibly productive. And I will say here that there was a podcast that I listened to and took a lot of solace in the first year, which was actually explicitly trying to foster a solidarity with formerly colonized subjects in other parts of the world. Right? So there was this attempt to actually do that kind of bridge building work that I think Ukrainians really need to be doing and are trying to do. On the other extreme, we have decolonization being used to rename streets without the consent of citizens, right? And we know the case of Odessa, and we know how that has been received by large segments of the Odessan population. We see how decolonization kind of becomes a binary that tries to resolve the impossibly challenging linguistic landscapes of Ukraine today, right? The language choice question, the ways that we coerce or support, right, the Ukrainian people to speak the Ukrainian language. So there are the kind of extreme manifestations of it that I think have been damaging. And then I think there have been these really beautiful adaptations of the rhetorics of decolonization that foster these solidarities in meaningful ways. So I'm not inclined to like sort of generalize too much. Mm-hmm. I think the other way I would answer what I heard in your question, I hope I heard it right, but is for me as a scholar, I was in graduate school at the moment when everyone was asking, you know, is the post in post-Soviet the same as post in post-colonial? And that was a real kind of fascination at that moment. And I think I really benefited from asking that question as a Ukrainianist. I have real questions about the application of those frameworks to the Russian case, however. Mm-hmm. And revisiting Morozov's work now really prominently raises those questions anew to me. How can post-colonial theory be actually applied to the Russian imperial case, but especially to the Soviet case, the Russo-centric Soviet case, I mean to say. I think it's a much more useful analytic to think through in the cases of the non-Russian republics. Mm-hmm. And to see it taken up in those spaces has, I think, been a meaningful thing to watch develop over the last 20 years now. So I'm not sure where we're at. You know, I was just rereading the 2006 forum that Gayatri Spivak participated in, where she poses the question, are we post-colonial, right? And poses it to post-Soviet peoples. And I was really struck reading Vitaly Chernetsky's response. Sorry, I'm in the weeds now, but Vitaly Chernetsky's response to Spivak, where he says, if you're asking me, am I a post-colonial subject? Absolutely yes. Yes, I am, right? And then Chernetsky also anticipates the critique that I'm starting to build around this decolonial school, where there's a sort of flexibility around the Russian imperial past that allows it to continue to co-opt the decolonizing rhetorics that the Soviet Union had capitalized on in the mid-century as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm opening floor for questions and comments, and I see that there are already couple questions online, so I will be managing both audience here in the room and audience online, and I will be discriminated in favor of the audience in the room. So
thank you to the people online for joining too.
Yes. Okay, so while you're thinking about your first question, people already have it, so I will read it from there. So it's Emily Frey. I would just like to point out that there are some fairly vertiginous ironies in the use of Tchaikovsky Fourth at the Mariupol concert. Fate in that symphony is pretty clearly marked as tragic, not something to be celebrated. If the F minor key weren't enough of a clue, Tchaikovsky explicitly wrote to one Mac that his symphony was about the triumph of blunt, pitiless fate over an individual's happiness and well-being. And also the fate motive in Tchaikovsky 4 is in the rhythm of Polonaise. the very, and then, this is actually one question, but it's a long one. Dance rhythm that is so many 19th century Russian operas serves a marker of Polish anti-Russian values. There is a certain musical vertigo in the repurposing of a Polish dance rhythm in a tragic symphony as a symbol of Russia's cultural triumph over Ukraine.
Yeah. I don't hear a question, but I do agree.
Okay, maybe it's in section 3. Let me
But what I might do is just quickly respond to that.
Yeah,
if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Okay.
I don't see.
Which is to say that I think that's all really valuable.
That section, yeah.
Analysis, and I'm grateful to. I didn't catch the name of the person, but thank you for that deep dive into some of the nuances there. And I think that really allows us the opportunity, which I didn't take in the talk, although I briefly say I'm dealing with the mythologized figure of Tchaikovsky, as apart from the real person, right? Who was a human, who lived. And of course his biography is contested, but we know some things about Tchaikovsky, that he did cozy to imperial power, did make those choices, but of course, right, also had, lived a non-normative sexual life in the Russian Empire, and was really, truly, sincerely, apparently fond of musics that weren't from the imperial metropole, right? Had a relationship with Mykola Lysenko, for example. I mean, the story that gets told, and I believe it's well documented enough to repeat here, is that he encouraged Lysenko to stage Taras Bulba in the Imperial Theater, right? Tchaikovsky, I hope it doesn't seem like the talk is trying to depict that Tchaikovsky the man was some sort of, figure that we should dismiss. But I think the appropriation of this figure and the flattening of it, and part of that we can see in the way that the fate is translated from the original context to this staging of just a grotesque musical triumphalism, is an injustice to the legacy of a person who was a real complex person. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going back to the online questions. And this is from Jess Myers. In a time when the university would perhaps rather sleep blindfolds over its gimlet-eyed constituents, can you speak to spaces where you have found possibilities for the anti-imperial solidarities you talk gestures toward? Your talk gestures towards, and the question mark is at that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really valid question. And I will say that I have gained a lot from reading the Ukrainian journal Commons. I don't know how people in the room feel about it, but I find that they are doing tremendously important work to think about anti-imperial solidarities outside of Ukraine. I think that there are solidarity groups, including one in the United States, which is called, I'm going to mix them up. There's one in the UK and there's one in the US that are called Ukrainian Solidarity Campaign. That might be the UK version. Sorry, people online, if I'm screwing this up. But there are groups that specifically frame their activities around fostering solidarity and building solidarity with other groups waging anti-colonial struggle. So I think those would be places to start. But I think, if you're in the place to support, Solidarity Collectives is another group that positions themselves as anti-authoritarian warriors on the front in Ukraine. That there are these spaces where this kind of work is happening, but it's somewhat against the grain, right? And it's also a real question of whether those solidarities are being met in all cases. But I've taken a lot of solace in finding those spaces and wanting to support them in any way that I can.
Okay, great, thank you. My third attempt. Okay, please.
Thank you so much for a brilliant talk. I think we're all speechless from how well you have really fleshed out the issues here, and they are really complex because they indeed kind of flip from one side to another as they are applied in real life, right, to real life situations. And we see how skilled certain Russian actors are in using, not just the culture itself, but also various concepts of culture's appropriation for their own propaganda and other purposes. My question is more about kind of the landscape, the ideological landscape. So you mentioned about the kind of certain shortcomings or perhaps difficulties in applying the concept in Ukraine. So kind of the various issues that emerge when a concept is applied without maybe too much thought or too reactive of sorts. And it seemed like kind of the left was more inclined to be more sensitive to that. I wonder if you maybe could just map out the landscape for us a little bit in terms of, because the kind of, as we know, what happened a lot as well, especially on the part of Russia, is that certain right segments of Ukrainian population that have been very important to Ukraine's defense and to, especially in very critical moments of the full-scale invasion, as well as earlier during the Maidan protests, for defending Ukraine's very existence. So very often those little segments are identified with all of Ukrainian population and then flattened farther down and kind of into an image of the far right, which is, as we know, not exactly. So maybe just kind of in applying the various concepts of the decolonial, anti-colonial struggle, the concept of post-colonialism and de-imperialization, if you could just, in as many, very maybe broad strokes as time allows, map out for us the landscape in Ukraine, I would appreciate it.
Oh, wow. I don't know that I'm really qualified to be totally honest with you, but I do appreciate that. And I think that, one thing that is, the first thing I want to say is that I was talking to a scholar of war who, because I was fretting about the Ukrainian right, and he pointed out to me that, the right are very often the ones that will go fight first, unfortunately. And in the case of a war of defense and an existential war, you need those people, unfortunately, right? And so the question is how proportionate are they? How much power do they hold, et cetera? I am not really close to demographic data, and part of the personal tragedy of the war, not to dramatize it, I've been in the safety of the United States, but is that I haven't been to Ukraine since just before the full-scale invasion. So I haven't actually been to the place where this is all unfolding, and I'm getting accounts from friends and colleagues and family there. But I find that on social media, at least, I am encountering accounts that are hard to believe sometimes, and it really makes me worry about the information economy in which we're existing, and what the incentives are to speak, and why certain people seem to inflate certain aspects over others. I think we're all dealing, right, with the information economy overload, and the erosion of trust in previously trusted institutions. And in the Ukrainian case, this is just so mightily exploited on social media, which is all prefatory material to say, I'm not sure that I know, to be honest with you, and I wouldn't want to proclaim. But I think as far as the rhetorics of decolonization operate, one of the really interesting things that happens in this vertiginous scene is the way in which what was kind of a left-wing concept, right? Primarily, decolonization was often framed as a left-wing project in the mid-century, at least, has today been appropriated by right-wing segments. And I know this to be true in the Russian case, right? And I spoke a little bit about Alexander Dugin, but he's the clearest example of this on the Russian propaganda side. And I imagine that it's also true on the Ukrainian case when we think about the ways in which the kind of extreme version of decolonization is being carried out in some cases. It's not an answer to your question, I apologize, but it's the best I can do right now. Can I say one more thing, which is I was talking to a colleague, Peter Schmeltz, who was saying that he was writing about Silvestrov's impossible compositions, and he found it impossible to write the paper. And I just thought, when I was putting this together, the vertigo feeling, I really experienced it as a kind of dizzying as a dizzying experience. It is a disorienting feeling to think like, what is left and right anymore when we have the sort of leftist decolonial school merging seemingly with the far right Putinist philosophers. I mean, I don't think they're in direct conversation with each other, but the sort of epistemological basis that they're working from is bizarrely consonant.
Thank you. I'm going back online, and here is a comment and question from Patrice Dobrovsky. Powerful lecture that in the USA, ballet company's cash cow is a nutcracker, and we celebrate our Independence Day by watching fireworks to the sound of the 1812 overture speaks either to the universality you referenced or to our own cultural laziness. Both leave me sad, especially today when the Russian imperial model has taken over our country. Is the economic component not important also here? Economics trumping ideology, no pun intended, and making us all more vulnerable.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm inclined to, I think the economic incentive to play the hits, the greats, right, is huge. And I think that deserves to be aired out for sure in this talk more. And I'm like susceptible to the cranky Adornian critique also, right, that we are a little bit lazy as listeners. And to, what is it? Correct me if I have this wrong, but to recognize the thing is the same as to like it, right? And especially if it's high culture, you think, oh, I know this, I recognize this, I've heard the Nutcracker before. You also feel kind of the aura of superiority, right? I know the great thing. So Adorno was writing about this in the 30s and 40s, and it feels resonant today. I think the fact that classical music culture, the culture of high, so-called high culture music, has been in a state of decline and crisis for some time, has a lot to do with the fact that the model isn't working. I cited in this talk a few times my late friend and colleague, Richard Taruskin, who every time I dip back into his works, what I receive from it is this impassioned desire for things to change. He really loved classical music. He loved it so much. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but the image of him driving up, we would go on a weekly walk, and he would drive up, and there would just be like a Bruckner symphony blasting from the car speakers in the little car that he drove. It was just this man loved this music, but he was in a kind of state of despair over the culture of it, right? And how far the culture of classical music had gone from the kind of like real emotional, impassioned intentions of composers in their time. I'm not someone who works in programming opera companies or anything, but I do think that the idea of revisiting the concept of greatness is a challenge to canonicity fundamentally, and it would be a challenge to the kind of stable canon of pieces that we know will bring in audiences every time that it's Christmas. And I imagine that's an unsettling thought for the people who run these kinds of places. Maybe the last thing I'll say, and Patrice, I really appreciate you raising this question, is that I started to think about this because I'm primarily a person who has worked on the 20th and 21st centuries. I'm not a scholar of the imperial past, and I'm definitely not a Tchaikovsky scholar. I focus on Ukrainian music almost exclusively, so this is really kind of outside of my zone of comfort. But I was invited a few months after the full-scale invasion to write an essay for the San Francisco Opera, which was staging Eugene Onegin. And when they announced the season, which I believe was their centennial season, so like a big deal, they announced that they would have Eugene Onegin in the program, and there were protests on the street of San Francisco. I don't know how large they were, but they were enough that they got the attention of the administration in the San Francisco Opera. And they reached out to me, of all people, to say, would you write an essay for our program book about kind of the ethics of staging this opera in this time, in the months following the full-scale invasion? And they were very clear that they understood the critique, but that they had planned to stage this for 2 or 3 years before it came to San Francisco. The economic investment was so vast that there was just no chance, right, of changing tack at that point. They were too far in. And I knew that, and that was part of the reason that I agreed to try to write something for them, right, to kind of really think through where I stand in relationship to these questions. And that was now incredibly almost 3 years ago, right, that I started to dip my toe into this Tchaikovsky problem. And here we are 3 years later. So I don't know. All I can say is that there was a lot of pearl clutching about our children being deprived of the greatness of Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker. And I just know that everywhere I look, all the targeted ads that I receive around Christmas time are for the Nutcracker. There has not been a single dent made, right, in the kind of cult and the canonic kind of stature of these works. And maybe that's fine, but that's where we are.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Bogdan over there, please.
Okay, thank you so much, first of all, for your brilliant talk. I really learned a lot. I was wondering about success stories. I was really intrigued by this notion that you mentioned, the piece in 1970 and another piece also in the 1970s about great women writers. And of course, some time has passed since then. And I was wondering whether you see some success stories in that respect that we could learn from. And what would be the lessons that you would suggest we could learn from in that respect? And perhaps more generally, we could learn from this kind of, if you will, gender studies perspective or women writers / feminist studies more generally that we could apply as well. And another part of this question, which also relates to the question of success stories, whether you think that in terms of Ukrainian music and promoting Ukrainian music, sharing this knowledge about Ukrainian music, whether in that respect there have been some success stories. Particularly, I would be really interested to and intrigued to hear your thoughts about the promotion of Shchedrik. To what extent, from your experience, of course, we do not have any stats, I wouldn't imagine, but that has had some kind of impact. And as a small part of that question as well, can the popularity of contemporary Ukrainian music make up for this kind of absence of canonicity in that respect? And could we go down that route? Or in parallel at least, can that be successful?
When you mean contemporary music, are you thinking of like academic music, like composed music, or popular music?
Right question, I mean pop music.
Okay, yeah.
More popular in any case.
So those are all wonderful questions, and there's just almost no chance that I'm going to remember them to be able to answer them. So I may need you to repeat them again. But I will start with what I remember from the Pauline Oliveros 1970, Why Are There No Great Women Composers? Which is a question that now has a long lineage of debate in music studies as well. And yes, I think there is evidence of success, right? And part of that has been this compensatory move. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Marcia Citron, writing about the canon and women, I'm cognizant of the fact that there are people in the room who may know this better than I do, spoke about the compensatory phase as kind of phase one, to sort of like supplement the canon with the women who were absent. And that has become pretty standard in most music departments that I know of, right? That now when you teach the history of musical composition, you include, Hildegard von Bingen, and you include Clara Schumann, and you include the women, right? You might include Pauline Oliveros. That doesn't really get to the bigger question that Pauline Oliveros was asking in 1970, which is how do we change the rules of the game? And that's what I'm really starting to become interested in. So maybe if I'm remembering correctly your second question, that relates to that. Which is, I think there's been tremendous work being done by Ukrainian cultural workers to advocate for Ukrainian music and to raise awareness about it. And I'm really grateful for that work, and I don't mean anything that I say to undermine anything that's been done. But I think I am skeptical of the frameworks that suggest that Letoshinsky is the Ukrainian Shostakovich, because then we really are reproducing the logics of the game again, right? The kind of same logics of greatness, so we can compete on the same terms of greatness. And again, what Pauline Oliveros was suggesting is what we need is more people composing and less concern with greatness. Where does that lead us inevitably, right? Like maybe into this messy world where we don't have hierarchies as clearly delineated. Kind of sounds nice to me, frankly. But I think that there is some of that work happening. One of the essays that I read about the debates inside of Ukraine about Tchaikovsky's status touched on the internal Ukrainian decision to not program Tchaikovsky inside of Ukraine. And that article also, I think, was pretty balanced, and I wish I could remember the author's name. But in terms of thinking about the internal debate about whether that was the right choice or not, and that author also concluded that by not programming Tchaikovsky in the year 2023, that it created space in the program. And it created space for new compositions, some compositions that were written in direct response to what was happening in Ukraine. And that audiences were still coming. They were motivated to come because the moment they were living in made it so that urgently composed pieces needed to be heard by these audiences. And one wants to imagine that that used to be what the culture of concert going might have been a little bit more like. That was one of your questions, I think. And then the third question was about contemporary musical practices. I did remember in the end. It's been a very long day. I started my day driving from the Hudson Valley of New York and listening to a debate between Alexandre Dugin and Bernard Henri, what is his name? Yeah, Lévy. So that's where I started today. I just thought I should check that out. So your third question about contemporary musical practices. I think again that there's really exciting stuff happening in the arena of contemporary music in Ukraine in all genres, and I think a lot of the people who are doing the so-called high culture music are really interested in leveling that too. Now you're discovering I listen to a lot of podcasts. One of the other podcasts I listened to today was an interview with Sochor, again, the bass player from Veve, who also loves opera. And it was a long discussion about his love for opera and the ways in which it has inspired his own punk compositional practices, So there's a lot of destabilizing of these kind of hierarchical categories that also finds its match in other places in the world, right? I think the 19th century canon is a very particular fixed space because canonicity emerges in this period of time. But the 20th century was a lot about destabilizing that already. Pop music, which is really the area that I spend most of my time thinking about, has been, I think, a very effective tool of wartime cultural diplomacy for Ukrainians. And I think that I don't know enough to say, but I know that it has been very effective in the West, in Europe and in North America, and somewhat effective in other parts of the world. But I know that, for example, Dacha Bracha, who is the kind of ethno-chaos band that is perhaps the best known contemporary Ukrainian popular music outside of Ukraine, have also toured to Mexico and Brazil, right? Have kind of made attempts to reach out to those spaces in the global south. And I just hope we see more of that. I know that there's a lot of interest in that kind of outreach, and I hope we see it more and more.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really brilliant, as was mentioned. I don't really need this. Do I need this? I have a very loud voice. I'm a very visual person, so I just wanted to comment on that graphic.
Yeah.
And how, when I first saw it, it actually did give me vertigo, which I'm sure was the intention, and the dizzying quality of that. It was, but to see the actual Mariupol theater and to know that that image came from that, and to see the scaffolding and the literary figures that were, I guess, placed on a
It's a wrap, like
a wrap. It was so jarring, and I cannot get rid of that image of the Kremlin playing on that stage and how horrific that was. And my question is, where did the people come from to participate in that concert? I mean, and how could that have all played out after this absolute disastrous event?
I wish I knew the answer to that, and I don't. But and first of all, I'm sorry for putting this image in your head, and I'm sorry to everyone for putting these images in your head. But
Okay,
I think
something that doesn't need to be avoided.
Yeah, I encountered this this image of the scaffolding wrap sort of by accident. Like I wasn't reading to find the scaffolding wrap. I hadn't read anything about it. It was just the image that was showing what the theater looked like, and I just thought, oh my God, is that Shevchenko there? You know, is that Gogol and Shevchenko? And then I thought, well, that makes a lot logical sense from the Russian side, right? They're reuniting the three Slavic peoples under the umbrella of the great Russian, all Russian culture. But how sinister that felt to me. I felt like it felt revolting to me. And so I really wanted to kind of stay with that example. And I knew that they had staged a concert, but I didn't know what had been on the I didn't know what it was on the program. And I was like, I bet there's Tchaikovsky on there. And sure enough, you know, and then it's the Fourth Symphony, which has this kind of resonance because of its programmatic title. I don't know. I mean, I think that there are probably people from Mariupol who are there. This was 6 months after the bombing, so their time had elapsed. And, you know, I heard a colleague talk about the kind of the very swift attempt by the Russian occupation regime to sell apartments in Mariupol to Russians, also within that time frame. So some vast amount of the city has been absolutely destroyed, and still we can see the occupation regime moving very swiftly, right, to try to pretend that like this is real estate that is desirable and to kind of paper over the horrors that happened in that city.
Thank you. Yeah, I see Taras and I see Zhenya over there. So I am now, I started to pay attention to time. So I'm now switching completely mode from encouraging you to ask questions. I'm not discouraging you to ask them, but please keep them short. And I see at least 3 also online. So I'll go now for 1 question online, then 1 in the audience, 1 online, 1 in the audience. And I ask you to keep your questions short, and I know that.
And I'll try to keep my answers short.
Okay, good. And I will be shortening the ones online. Yeah, the question is from Raymond Arendt. Isn't there a deeper aspect when Russians say Ukraine is not a human language, quote unquote human language, more than just colonial aspects, but dehumanizing?
Oh, yes. I'll answer that very quickly. Yes.
Yes. Okay, good.
So I'll preface this: 1, I'm not an academic, and 2, I was, an American of Ukrainian descent, raised in the diaspora, which you're very much aware of. So there are some biases, but it seems to me like the anti-imperial or post-colonial model is based on the sort of maritime empires that we talked about, which were about extracting wealth, and then maybe fetishizing culture. Whereas in the Russian model, it's more about, we need a culture, so we're going to co-opt this one and others as well. Has the scholarship accounted for that when talking about sort of decolonizing? That is not, this isn't certainly there were resource extraction parts of the colonization, but there was a lot more to it than just let's go take gold or emeralds or other natural resources. And it wasn't a fetishizing, it was more of like, this is ours.
Yeah, yes. And so I think you're pointing towards the question that always probably should be addressed when we think about Ukraine as a post-colony in some way, which is, was it a colony, right? Like, how do we define then its colonial relationship to Russia and to its other former imperial entities? So it's not a straightforward question, and I actually I would defer to the historian really, but I'm thinking about a forum that I read recently with Shavelov and Hrytsak, I want to say, which was exactly asking that question. It was Ukraine a colony, and they both had a really nuanced approach to answering that question because, of course, many Ukrainian elites traveled to the Russian imperial metropole. The institution of serfdom was not confined to national borders, and so the hierarchical nature of imperial society, was reproduced in a lot of the cities, including in Kyiv, of course, and other places in Ukraine. The shared origin, I'm repeating things that many many people in this room know, but the kind of like site of Kyiv as the origin story for both contemporary nations is such an important contested fact. In the case of musical production, you know, a lot of, and Marika Kuzma, my colleague, and a beautiful scholar and choral director, has done a lot of really important work to think about the ways in which Ukrainian composers were trained in what is now modern Ukraine and then sent to St. Petersburg to staff the choirs, etc. The features of appropriation, I think, are very marked in this case, and that has a lot to do with the contiguous territory. Although I think that these dynamics of appropriation exist in other cases as well, and I will just maybe make a very provocative claim here, but if we consider the US a kind of empire, that it also had a kind of love and theft is the famous formulation from Eric Lott, a love and theft relationship to its internally colonized peoples as well. So that is also a kind of imperial technology, let's say. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. A question from Judge Grabovich. Were there, to your mind, any interesting or productive Ukrainian formulations of the Russian use of Shevchenko in the Mariupol theater, context that you demonstrated? Other than outrage, was there any examination of self-awareness or simply nuance?
In the appropriation of Shevchenko.
So were there, to your mind, any interesting or productive Ukrainian formulations of the Russian use of Shevchenko in the Mariupol theater context that you demonstrated? Other than outrage, was there any examination of self-awareness or simply nuance?
I have to be honest that I haven't observed any Ukrainian reactions to the scaffolding rap image. If I'm answering the question correctly. So I think that, you know, I saw the image and felt outrage, perhaps. And also, because I'm trying to inhabit the mind of Russian propagandists a lot of the time, understood the logic, the brutal logic and the twisted logic, but I could see what they were doing, right? Mm-hmm. By starting us with Pushkin and getting us to Shevchenko across the front of the facade. So that might be how I address this question.
Yeah. I recognized actually the pattern from pre-1917. Mm-hmm. Shevchenko was claimed by the club of the Russian nationalists. Shulgin was proud that his children were reciting Shevchenko better than the children of the Ukrainophiles. Mm-hmm. So again, this is going back to pre-1917 model of the big Russian nation and incorporating Shevchenko in particular.
Yeah, and of course the Soviet case of elevating Shevchenko is also hugely important, right? As the kind of...
Right. Except that in Soviet case, they already portrayed him as a Ukrainian, maybe not proletarian author, but Ukrainian. Mm-hmm. For Shulgin, he is a Russian.
He's in, right. Yeah. Got it. Yeah, that's important.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, for answering all of those questions. I'm an academic in training, but I'm also Ukrainian, so I'm biased. First, I wanted to shortly give a little pushback on the whole decolonization in Ukraine performed by more right-wing audience. Most of the people you cited and most of the podcasts you cited are people who are left or left of center.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the appropriation of the of decolonization discourse is actually not happening on the right. They don't care. They just take it down, because this is people who are actually think about it. Like people in Spilne, those people are actually try to reiterate in a discussion and make sense of it. And Spilne are not alone in this, though. I do understand why they are on the radar. Though I wanted to ask the question more about your kind of manifestation on the wall. You wanted to leave it for us, because some of them are really close to what Professor Kevin Platt wrote in very not great timing in April 2022, while bodies were excavated from pits in Bucha and other places. That's basically when you talk canceling Russian culture, you're feeding into Putin's narrative. Outside that, I don't think that this argument is productive. It's actually not doing nothing else, just exonerating Russian narratives. What would be the actual medicine against the decolonial vertigo? Like, if there is a way to do this in one sentence. Thank you.
Yeah, I do want to respond to the first part because I think I'm clear on that, but I'm trying to make the case that has been also part of the critique that comes from the left in Ukraine is the conflation of decommunization. Well, the intellectual left. Anyway, yes, I know them too. But the people who are represented by Spilne and the people who are like center left, I'm not thinking, whatever these words mean right now, frankly. But the conflation of decommunization policies with decolonization rhetorics at times takes on right-wing attributes. That is not the case of the people I was quoting, but it is a thing that I think is a real phenomenon that is happening. The other part of your question about what are the repositioning maneuvers, I mean, I don't really have a solution for us. I think what I've laid out is the trap, the complexity of the trap that's been laid, and how we move past it and kind of anchor ourselves against this vertiginous swirl is something that is hard to have a simple answer to. At the end of the talk, I was trying to give 3 kind of possible avenues for action in 2 very specific audiences. So in the case of music, I think, I'm going to say it, decolonizing greatness might be the thing to really hold on to as a plank. In the case of the geopolitical context that we're in, which is changing hour to hour right now, the thing that gives me, I think that solidarity is probably the answer, right? I think that figuring out how to foster solidarity across bridges that are hard to imagine right now is probably the brace against this multipolar world that is being currently carved up by authoritarians here and there.
Thank you. And I will actually, there are 2 remaining questions online. If you don't mind, I will read them together and you will answer. So they're also very different. Anya Dubovik asks, is there any way to explain an average Joe why we should boycott Tchaikovsky now without looking crazy? And question from Jack Lewis, the decolonizing imperialist dialectic can also exemplified in particularly autocratic leadership styles of Daniel Ortega, Nicaragua, and Paul Kagame, Rwanda. Does discourse of native settler dynamics offer an analogous context for the fascinating phenomenon outlined in your talk?
I think I'll take that second question quickly just to say the native settler dichotomy I think is potentially also a dead end. And I have found a little bit of comfort in Mahmoud Mamdani's book, which is called Neither Settler Nor Native, that proposes a solution to kind of intractable conflicts, including in the United States, the division between native peoples here and settlers, European mostly settlers, but everyone who's not native to this country, and also Israel and Palestine, and takes South Africa as a model for how to kind of overcome the binary of settler and native. So maybe that's answering that question to some point. And the other question, will you remind me quickly?
Yeah, and
how to not
then
boycott.
about the average Joe.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know, and unfortunately, I don't think so. I've been trying to think a little bit with other cases, other calls for cultural boycott, and again, the South African case is a really evocative one to think with. The South African call for a cultural boycott was very controversial in its time. It remains controversial today, in part because boycotts are a form of censorship. They exert control, right, over music practitioners in the case of music. And also they are a collective action that can exert pressure on oppressive regimes. And it is a real dilemma. I think a very important distinction between the South African case and the Ukrainian case, when we're thinking about so-called high culture, is the particular, like, the potency of these enduring ideas of universalism that are married to high culture, that are somehow divorced from the realms of popular culture. And in the South African case, at least the cases I know that come to mind, were typically more in the realm of popular culture. So the analogy doesn't hold for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of dynamics to unpack there. But I think it would be instructive to think across other cases of calls for cultural boycott and how they have worked or not. My fear is that there's not a way to call for the boycotting of Tchaikovsky that will win sympathy in the world today, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you so much. We're only 28 minutes over time. So thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you for staying engaged with questions, and thank you for all of for coming and then staying engaged, certainly. And I almost forgot, I know that my colleagues would never forgive me for that. There is announcement for our next event. It will be happening on Friday from 5 to 6:30 at Funk Auditorium. It's Boylston Hall, and it will be online as well. It will be a talk by Sasha Dovzhik, director of Index, Institute for Documentation and Exchange. And this is a new institution created in Lviv with primarily goal, as far as I understand, collecting evidence about the war. And what is the role of writing in wartime when not only bodies, cities, and landscapes are hit by the enemy's shells? So this is basically one of the themes that will be there in the talk. So you can get more information online, and I look forward to seeing you back on Friday. So just a couple of days away from now, you can hang around. Okay, thank you. Thanks once again.